Hey there, ready to really get into it this time. We're diving deep into the life of Crispus Attucks. You know, the name you see in history books, maybe even a monument or two. Well, we're going way beyond that today. We got a whole bunch of sources here, like old newspaper articles, poems, you name it, trying to piece together who this guy really was. And let me tell you, the more we dig, the more interesting it gets, that's for sure. Yeah, that's what makes Crispus Attucks so fascinating, you know, centuries later. And there's still so much we don't know about him. He's become this huge symbol. Yeah, I was like a legend. But when you really look for the details of his life, they could be really hard to pin down. Right? Like, we can start with what little we know for sure. He was of Wampanoag and African descent, worked as a seaman, a dock worker, just trying to make a living in Boston back then. But it really is like we've only got a handful of puzzle pieces, and we're missing most of the picture. And even the pieces we do have, they just give us these tiny glimpses into this really complex world he lived in. You got to try to picture it. Colonial America, totally divided by race. Now imagine Attucks trying to navigate all that, possibly multiracial himself, at a time when those distinctions were a huge deal. Makes you wonder, how did someone in his position even begin to build a life? It's kind of mind-blowing, right? Like, we read about this stuff in history books, but to actually think about how that played out in Attucks' daily life, the way people saw him, the things he had to overcome just to exist, that's a powerful story waiting to be told. Absolutely. And it just goes to show you, even with major historical events, the people who were actually there probably experienced them in a totally different way than we imagine. We can talk about the rising tensions in Boston, how much people hated British rule and all, but for Attucks, it likely looked really different on the ground. Which leads us to that night in March of 1770, the Boston Massacre. So picture it. Everything's about to boil over, right? British soldiers, colonists, they're headed for a clash, and then boom, chaos. And we know Attucks was right there in the middle of it. But what was he actually doing? Was he a leader, standing up for what he believed in? Or was he more caught up in the frenzy, a kind of an agitator? We're still debating this stuff. See, now that's where it gets really interesting. All we have to go on are eyewitness accounts from back then. But just like any story, you've got to figure those accounts are colored by people's own viewpoints and prejudices. So how are we supposed to separate fact from fiction all these years later, especially when each of those facts was seen so differently? It's like we're talking about a different planet, not just a different time. And that's the thing historians wrestle with all the time. It reminds us that history isn't just about names and dates. It's about understanding the context, all the little details, the different ways people saw the same event. That's how it really comes alive, you know? It's wild, right? It's like we're straining to hear these whispers from the past, trying to get inside Attucks' head in that moment. Yeah, and even though those whispers are faint, they tell us something pretty huge happened. Attucks was the first one killed in that massacre, shot twice right in the chest. And his death, along with the others, it sparked outrage, man. That's what really lit the fuse for the revolution. It's hard to even imagine sometimes one guy right in the middle of all that chaos, and he becomes the symbol of, like, fighting back, a martyr for freedom and all that. Kind of crazy. It is. And that's when his story takes this whole other turn. See, as time went on and the colonies got closer to actually rebelling, Attucks' story, it took on a life of its own. So he's not just some tragic victim anymore, right? He becomes like this icon. Bingo. Fast forward to the 1800s. The abolitionist movement's gaining steam, and they see Attucks as this perfect hero for their cause. This guy standing up to oppression, proof that even when things seem their worst, one person can still make a difference. And it wasn't just talk either, right? They actually started doing things to remember him, like Crispus Attucks Day, poems, plays, even those massive monuments. It's like he transcended time and became this legend or something. Speaking of monuments, there's that huge one over in Boston Common. You know the one I mean. Attucks is right up front, his name there with the other victims. It's quite a sight, really shows you how long his legacy has lasted. Oh yeah, I've seen pictures. That thing is massive. You can't help but feel the weight of history when you look at it. It's definitely a powerful tribute. But it also makes you think, you know, because while all this grand stuff was happening, they kind of downplayed some parts of who Attucks was, like whether he was multiracial and all that. It makes you wonder whose version of history we're really getting, and how different it might have been depending on who was telling it. Right. That's the thing, isn't it? Like, we're always trying to put the past together, but we have to remember we're looking at it through their eyes, you know, the biases they had, their point of view, even their goals. It all shapes how we see things generations later. That's what makes history so interesting, though. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about the context, all the little details, the different ways people saw the same event. That's how it comes alive, you know? It's about asking questions, not just accepting what we're told, and realizing that history is messy, not black and white. Exactly. And when we look closer at Crispus Attucks, we can see how his story is still relevant today, all these years after his death. It's really something, you know, how one guy's story can echo through time like that. I mean, people are still talking about him. You don't see schools and parks and even theaters named after just anyone. It shows you just how big of an impact he had. And it's more than just physical places too, right? They put him on a U.S. silver dollar, a permanent reminder. And there's that scholar, Molefiki DeSante, he listed Attucks as one of the 100 greatest African Americans. Seriously impressive legacy. It seems like everybody wants to call him their own symbol, a symbol of fighting back, a martyr for freedom, an icon for Black history. And that's where it gets even more interesting, I think. It's like that Stevie Wonder lyric, first man to die for the flag we now hold high was a Black man. Really makes you think about how Attucks' story connects with different people, you know? Each group sees something of themselves in them, their own struggles. Yeah, it's like his story is a mirror, kind of reflecting back on us, making us think about the past, yeah, but also how we see it today. Exactly. This isn't just about Crispus Attucks, the man, but about all of us. How we try to make sense of history, how we choose to remember stuff, and how those choices change the way we see ourselves and the world. So after all this deep dive into a guy shrouded in mystery, a guy who became something much bigger than himself, what do we take away from it all? Maybe it's that history isn't set in stone. You know, it's a conversation that keeps going, always changing. And like any good conversation, there's going to be disagreements, different sides to the story. Attucks' legacy, with all the things we still don't know for sure, it's a good reminder that trying to understand the past is a journey. You got to ask the tough questions and be open to the fact that there's more than one right answer. Man, this whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's amazing what you can learn when you really dig in and go beyond just the basic facts, you know. So, to everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. What really stood out to you about Attucks? How does his story connect to what's going on today? Think about that. Keep learning, and don't be afraid to dive deeper into the stuff that made us who we are. Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive, signing off.